Hi, and welcome back to Digital Defense. My name is Jordan Robertson. I'm a cybersecurity reporter with Bloomberg News here in Washington, D.C. This is our weekly cybersecurity web show. As always, we are broadcasting live on Facebook and Periscope and other mediums. And if you have any questions during the course of this show, please feel free to leave them in the comments. And we're going to try to get to as many of them as we can today. And feel free to comment or ask questions about the topic we're going to be discussing or anything else on your mind related to cybersecurity. This is supposed to be an audience-driven show, and we tend to get some really great questions. So thank you in advance for that. The topic that I wanted to discuss today is a concept in cybersecurity called deception cybersecurity. And the news peg for this was the French presidential election. And some of you may recall that one of the primary candidates, the eventual winner of that election, was hacked. His campaign was hacked. And kind of literally at the 11th hour, I mean, as campaigning was ending, several hours before campaigning was ending, attackers believed to be the same group that attacked the U.S. election, Russian-linked operatives, dumped, just a trove of emails and other documents onto the internet, purporting to be from this person's campaign. And that was a very different operation than what happened here in the U.S., where we had weeks and months of disclosures and leaks. I mean, dozens and dozens of different document dumps from members of Hillary Clinton's campaign, the Democratic National Committee, very different operation. Nonetheless, there were some pretty striking similarities, between these operations, with one really crucial difference. When the attackers hacked the French presidential campaign, again, there was a very small window, within which they released all these documents, kind of the 11th hour, presumably hoping that news media would pick up on the most salacious stuff in there, and publish that and damage this candidate, right on the eve of the election. That didn't happen. Didn't happen for a couple of reasons. One, the French media showed more restraint in publishing this information. Also, there were threats of legal action against those publishers, if they publish this hack material, which doesn't necessarily happen the same way here in the U.S. But also, most critically, it was within, you want to say a couple of hours after these documents became public that cybersecurity researchers pounced on them and very quickly discovered that these documents, many of these documents were faked. So here's the French presidential candidate and winner, and that's a significant difference, because what happened was, once these cybersecurity researchers jumped on these documents and discovered that a number of them looked real, but also a number of them looked obviously faked, the credibility of that data dump, just kind of went down the tubes. And it's kind of a curious thing to think about hackers having quote unquote credibility. But it's one thing we didn't see in the U.S. election. We didn't see the campaigns come out and say these documents are obviously faked. The reason was they appeared to be authentic. Now we all heard in the cybersecurity reporting community, we all heard rumblings that maybe some of the documents were faked, some of the information might have been faked, numbers and such. But it was never that was never a public issue. No campaign came out and said that these documents were obviously faked. And that led to a very interesting revelation by the Macron campaign in France, that they had actually seen this coming. They knew they were going to be a target. It was very clear that Russia was going to target their campaign. They were a very anti-Russia, pro-NATO, pro-NATO campaign, and they made it very clear that they were going to be a target. And U.S. intelligence agencies had warned them. They saw what happened in the U.S. Campaign, and they apparently took some pretty innovative, proactive steps to protect themselves, and that's the subject of the show today. They employed, again, this concept of deception security, and what one of the campaign technologists has said was that they knew they were going to be targeted. So what they did was they created dozens and dozens of these dummy email accounts and filled them with kind of garbage data or inflammatory information that was obviously untrue. And the point was not so much to discredit the data once it eventually would leak. It was more than anything to slow the hackers down, because these hackers want to make a public splash with these leaks, so they have to sift through it. They actually have to engage in data mining to figure out what they have and what's most important to leak to organizations like WikiLeaks or to contact journalists with things like that. And the thing that I want to talk about today is this concept of deception security is actually a pretty a pretty established and legitimate one, within the world of cybersecurity. Again, the French presidential election, featured this as had this as one of its, protective measures. But also, and you can see here, this is one of the screenshots, actually showing some of the metadata on one of the Excel spreadsheets, showing the name of a Russian programmer who is known to be linked with Russian intelligence operations. This is just one example of where, when the security researchers dug into these documents, they could very clearly see that data was either being altered or edited, or at the very least handled, by a foreign intelligence agency, which is a pretty clear marker that it's you should be careful, with the data. And what I wanted to show you, though, is when it comes to this idea of deception security, you're dealing with a concept that looks like this. This is from one of the cybersecurity companies that makes this kind of technology. The gray lines, indicate normal patterns and normal pathways within a computer network. The red lines are, pathways that the attackers use. The thing standing way out here is what they call a deception node. And these are basically, like, wherever you're watching this, chances are, if you work for a large company, they're employing some form of this technology. And that's not to mention, any of the, the cloud-based consumer internet tools, Gmail and Hotmail and Yahoo and all those kinds of things. This is a pretty common way that companies secure themselves and their applications for consumers as well. What they basically do is they will create mirror images of their real network, because hackers are not dumb. They know exactly what they're going after. So if you just kind of stand up a garbage network, they're going to know that's useless, and they're not going to go there. So what these security companies do is they stand up, either mirror images of the real network, except they fill email accounts with, with kind of meaningless, meaningless data, or just kind of inoffensive material, or they will, and the goal here is to attract the hackers. Like, you want hackers to go to this material, much like the Macron campaign wanted the attackers to find these dummy accounts and spend a lot of time there, to the point that even the campaign said they would direct the attackers and they would fill in those account details and respond to phishing emails, which is a crazy idea, which you'd never recommend anybody to do. But if you're trying to direct an attacker to a specific place where you want to bog them down, that's a really great strategy. And again, companies use techniques like this all the time to do the same thing. So we're getting some good questions here. I want to repeat the call for, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the comments section, or you can tweet to us at Technology on Twitter. That's our Bloomberg Technologies Twitter handle. So one of the questions here is, let's see here, is why is it that these attacks keep happening even with antivirus software? Well, antivirus software is actually, I have a riff about antivirus software that I want to share. So antivirus software is one of the very few segments of the cybersecurity industry that in some places is codified in law that you actually have to have on your system. So certain segments of retail, banking as well, when these regulations are written, in some cases, many years ago, the baseline is set, and in many cases the baseline is set of you need to have antivirus security. So antivirus, the antivirus industry, they don't like to talk about this, but there is an element of, kind of regulatory protection for the industry, as it were, and that may not have been the way it was designed, but that's certainly the way it's played out in some cases. So the antivirus industry is not only the most established part of the industry, but also in some cases, companies just have to have it. And there are very good reasons to have it too. It's not the world-beating technology it once was, but it catches a lot. The problem is it only catches what it's trained to catch. And those companies are, the companies that make it, are trying very hard to get the technology smarter and to learn to adapt to different techniques. But at base, antivirus technology only works against attacks that it has seen before. And attackers don't have to do very much to change their malware and change their coding to evade that particular type of security. Nevertheless, it's a big part of the industry, and it's not going away anytime soon. It's just not altogether as effective as many people might believe. Next question here, is there any way to check the computer for potentially installed malware after a phishing attack? Well, it depends on the phishing attack. As we discussed on previous episodes, one of the main ways to check if you've been hit by malware is actually to kind of reverse engineer your steps in what you've clicked on. Because I think a lot of people have the misconception that if you just click on a phishing email, you're going to be infected. In most cases, that's actually not true. There's almost always a second step. And the second step is, to click this link to, allow this document permissions to your email, or click this link to install these protective files. In fact, in the French election, that's what some of the phishing emails said. You guys are being targeted by attackers. Click this link and download protective cybersecurity technologies. I mean, it's stupid. Like, if you're going to click on that and you're a member of a campaign like that, and you've seen what's happened in the U.S., then it's kind of you're kind of asking for trouble. Nevertheless, it's always that second step. So what I advise people to do is you don't necessarily need to rush out and order some of these forensics tools that like Symantec and others will offer to remote into your computer for $50 or $100 and check for malware and things like that. In most cases, that's generally just not needed. If you can take care to not do that second click, in most cases you'll actually be okay, because phishing emails on their own are just a vehicle to get you somewhere else. So if you haven't done that second click, chances are you're okay. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, that's kind of the rule that I like to follow. Next question here is, why didn't the U.S. do what France did to fend off the Russian hackers? Well, that's a good question. Part of the problem was, I think the threat was underestimated in the U.S. We had written about this. We had written about a Colombian election hacker early in 2016, the result of a nearly year-long investigation, who told the whole story about how elections in Latin America are hacked in very much the same way. And that was kind of like a flare that we tried to send up, that, hey, look, this is something that is not actually that uncommon. It's just very much hidden. And I think part of the problem was, as we've heard it described to us from security experts, is if you think about who is involved in a political campaign, these are all people who are operatives in some sense of the word. They're either, people who are knocking on doors to get people registered to vote. They are political strategists who are trying to get out the vote in certain areas, or, kind of deal with media and things like that. These are not necessarily people that are watching their technology every day. What they are is they're on and off buses and on and off planes every single day. And the potential for things to go wrong is actually much higher, because you're on the road, you're clicking on things, you're getting hundreds of emails a day. So it's not necessarily a technology operation, it's a political operation. And what the U.S. could have done many, many things differently. One of them was, when the FBI discovered the attack, rang the bell louder with the Democratic National Committee, because what had happened was there was a great New York Times story that outlined exactly how long it took for the FBI to really notify the DNC in a serious way that this was an attack that was ongoing. And I think it was kind of a failure of vision. I think on behalf of the government to really recognize what the risks were here. And subsequent reporting has shown that when President Obama was in office, he didn't want to appear partisan in the election. He didn't want to appear that he was swaying the election one way or the other, so he didn't really want to get involved in it. He kind of wanted to let things sort themselves out, and that proved to be, kind of a pretty serious miscalculation, because these leaks kept occurring, and it eroded the quality of trust, that folks had in the system. So it's unclear, whether if these political campaigns had also, I will say this, if these political campaigns had done what the French candidate Macron had done and seeded their computer networks with all of this like misleading or false data, what would have happened was that they wouldn't have stopped the attack. And the French acknowledge that in their strategy as well. You can't stop the attack, but what you can do is make it harder for hackers to do what they're trying to do and bog them down. And that absolutely would have happened. And then most importantly, when the information leaked, if you can prove that even one document in that leak is fake, as what happened in France, you could undermine credibility of the whole thing. It doesn't mean it stops the stories, but as soon as it was determined that a number of those documents in France were fake, that had a really serious impact on how it was covered both domestically and abroad. So that's a really valuable strategy in information warfare, to undermine the adversary, and we didn't do any of that here in the U.S. Next question here is, can you recommend a good, cheap antivirus software? I'm not really in the business of recommending specific products, but I will say basically any antivirus product at this point is going to be fine. And the reason for this, reason for that is this. A few years back, all of the major cybersecurity companies that deal with consumers, so Symantec and even some that deal with enterprises, Palo Alto and others, Palo Alto Networks, that is. They came together and they said, look, we don't want to compete on data anymore. Security is such an important topic that we don't want to compete just on who has the bigger network, who has more customers. So we're going to share attack data, such as they're able to collect it. And what we're going to compete on is technology. Who can hire the best engineers? Who can create the better mousetrap, in other words? What that means is, the majority of the major cybersecurity vendors, especially those in antivirus, they're all going to have roughly the same data. They're going to have different techniques for mitigating threats, but my general view is any level of antivirus software, will probably be fine for most people. Free or cheap is really the way to go for most people. But however, I should also point out that I know a number of cybersecurity professionals who say they don't use any at all. What they do, however, is they make sure to monitor their permissions on their computer really carefully. And I'll give you one really great kind of tip that somebody gave me a long time ago that I think is really, really helpful even today. So if when you buy a laptop or a desktop and you set it up for the first time, it's really helpful to create a guest account, which is actually the one that you use most often. So the main account will have administrative privileges. The guest account will not. So if you disable administrative privileges for the guest account, which is what many people do for their guest accounts anyway, and you use that for the majority of your internet use, the value of that is if somebody tries to attack your computer, it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for them to install anything, because all this malware needs to install. And typically the way that's done is getting people to click on a link and you approving the installation. But if you're concerned about security, I highly recommend doing this dual account thing. And if a piece of malware is trying to install itself on your computer and you're not expecting it, you're going to get a flag. You're going to get an alert. And the beauty of that is it just can't install. So I feel like that's a really good tip for if you're concerned about this. In some ways, that kind of approach in many ways is better than antivirus. But that's just my personal opinion on that. Next question here is, does it help to delete your emails after you've read them? Here's the reason I like this question is, yes. And the reason is, now, people are of different minds on this question, because some people like to keep everything forever, and there's value in that. You can recreate your timeline, whether it's for work emails or personal, in a really compelling way, and it's really valuable, in many instances. However, the viewer has a really good question, because part of the problem with these leaks are, especially with the Podesta leaks, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, his emails were the bulk of the leaks that affected the US election. And it was just gigabytes and gigabytes of emails coming out every week. If you delete those emails, even if somebody attacks your account, they're not going to be able to leak it. However, there is a cost to that. And the cost is it's harder to reconstruct events from your life, whether those are family events or corporate events or whatever. But you can always offload. You can always, download your emails to a hard drive if you want to preserve them. And that does really, pretty strongly mitigate the risk of, if somebody breaks into your account, that they're going to steal everything and leak it. The problem with that is most of us work for companies, and many of us work for big companies. And big companies, especially regulated ones, like in the financial services sector, they keep everything, and they keep everything for a really long time. The one thing they don't always keep is network traffic, because that takes a lot of storage capacity, and it's very expensive to keep all that. But one thing that's really easy to keep forever is email. And part of the problem is when hackers get inside an email system like they did with Sony. Even if you delete your emails from your screen, your message screen on your, whatever your corporate email client is, that stays inside the corporate network. So it might be a little bit of a false sense of security to assume just because I've deleted a work email, it's no longer there. No, it's sitting on the corporate servers. And one of the things that attackers really like to go after inside corporations are the domain name administrators, the people who control, the entire internet infrastructure of a company, and that includes email. So, don't delude yourself into thinking that because you've deleted a corporate email, that is gone forever. If your company is hacked, as we saw with Sony, they could just leak everything for however long your company keeps it on site. And typically for many companies, that's like a year or so, and then they move it to storage. And that's just kind of industry standard. So you're likely to get at least a year's worth of email that way. Next question here, and again, feel free to write any questions in the comments section or tweet to us @technology. Is iOS the most secure system on the market? Again, I don't like to recommend specific products, but I will say, Apple's software does many things that that Windows and Android don't in terms of security. Apple came out several years ago and said the thing that differentiates Apple from Google, and these are kind of the arch nemesis in this space, is Apple's not a data company. Apple's a hardware company and a software services company. They don't sell data. That's just not their business. Now, there's some argument that maybe with iCloud and things like that, they might get into that business at some point, but at this point, it's still really not their business. So they will take steps to do things like block advertisers from tracking you on your iOS devices, and they will do things like the permissions. You get really fine-tuned control over your permissions on the device in terms of what apps have access to what types of data, location data, and things like that. And Android's pretty good too about giving users control over certain things. It's just not as apparent. And some might speculate that that's because Google's business is data. Turning off data collection, by default is just not in Google's interest in any way. They're going to add a few hurdles, to get there. But Google has been for the last several years, under an agreement with the federal government, to have better privacy practices, and I think it's like a 20-year agreement. So it's not there are very serious motivations for Google to make sure that people have options in that space. But when it comes to security, it's all about permissions. Like that's my big message on all this, is that if you've got your computer wide open and administrative access is wide open, anyone who's on that computer can do anything to it. It makes it a lot easier for attackers. But if, like the example I gave before, if you create this dual account system where you use only your guest account every time you're on the computer, and that has administrative access turned off, it's just harder to do stuff to it. Doesn't mean you won't get attacked. It doesn't mean you won't be tracked. But it's all about permissions and how you set them. It just takes a little bit of elbow grease, but it's really effective. Next question here is, what methods do hackers use to steal your private Facebook data? The way attackers typically work these days are, again, they want to get you to click on things. They want you to give them permission to access your stuff. It's just by far the easiest way to do things versus installing a piece of malicious software on your computer and then, watching and hoping you log on to Facebook. It's just time consuming. It's like an operational challenge that they have to manage all this data coming in. And there are automated tools for doing that, but in general, it's just very time consuming. So what they like to do instead, is they would like to have your Facebook login. They will send you a phishing email that will say, and here's their favorite technique. The favorite technique is a security alert. And this is what caused the Clinton campaign to get attacked in the US. It's a security alert. They'll send you something saying, hey, this is Google, your login has been, your account was somebody tried to access your account from overseas. We've blocked it, but you need to go in and change your password. And here's a link. Creating these accounts to be creating these messages to be fully convincing is trivial these days. So, we used to tell people just watch for obviously fake emails or bad grammar or misspellings or, icons of Google or Facebook that are just not quite right. But that's bad advice now. That's just not the way these phishing emails work. So you can't just rely on, oh, this looks like an obviously faked email from Facebook. I shouldn't click on that. And again, I always like to tell people, even if you've clicked on it, like you weren't thinking, like we've all done this, you click on it, and then you think, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. It doesn't mean you're infected. It doesn't mean you've got to throw away the computer. If you haven't done the second click, which is now enter your password, that's what Podesta did. He entered his email address, and he entered his password, then bingo, the hackers have it. If you haven't done that second level, in general, you should be okay. Now, the exception here is if you're being targeted, if you're in a position to be targeted by nation-state attackers, if you do work for the government, if you work for a company that would have data that's valuable to a foreign adversary, the threat is going to be different. But in general, for most people, it's going to be that security alert that you get from Facebook, from your bank, from Google, whatever, but that's not actually from them. And the other point I should mention on this is that we used to also tell people, look at the sending address, look who's sending it to you. If it's some bogus email address, then it's fake, don't click on it. It's trivial now to just replace whatever the email address they're sending it from with an authentic email, but it's just a spoof. It's not actually coming from bofa.com or whatever, or google.com. It's the hackers are just saying that in the message. So you can't trust that either. So my best advice on all this stuff is if you get a security alert from any of your internet services that you use, Go to the site yourself. Just don't click the link. Go to the site yourself, log in, see if the data matches, and the companies are really good about prompting you there. Companies in general are not going to send you a link about a security incident and have you click on it in the email. That's just a bad security practice. Another question here is it risky to access your bank accounts on your phone and computer, and how safe is online banking? Well, this is another pet issue of mine, actually, that banks have actually gotten really, really good at cybersecurity. They spend more money than almost any other industry. They're very much on the cutting edge of trying to detect fraud and trying to detect access to their systems. And as a result, not only do you have federal guarantees of if funds are stolen from your account up to a certain amount, I believe it's $250,000. You not only have that federal guarantee, but also these banks are so on top of it these days, that you'll get calls instantly if there's an anomalous purchase. Many of us have had the experience of, you could travel over a state line, you take a family trip or something, and you'll get a call like, hey, this doesn't look like you. Is this your purchase? Do you authorize it? And you click yes. So I actually have a lot of confidence in banks' abilities to protect most consumers these days. Because their alerting system and the anomaly detection systems have gotten so good. So I say sure. I mean, use the bank apps on your phone or computer or whatever, but always, always, always set up two-factor authentication. What that is you get a text message alert anytime somebody tries to log into your account or change the data within it. And the last point I'll make on this is, while I'm very optimistic about banks' abilities to protect consumers, banks are like one of the #1 targets for nation-state attackers who want access to the bank's own valuable information about how they work, trading algorithms, things like that. There's no real silver bullet for that. So, to assume that banks couldn't be compromised by nation states, it's a different discussion. And, those entities are very, very good at getting to where they want to go. But again, two kind of separate issues there. With that, I want to thank everybody for, for the great questions that came in. It's always nice to see that, this information is helpful. And, as always, you can reach me offline. If you have any questions, we can try to get to them in a future episode. Please feel free to tweet to us, again, @Technology, which is the Bloomberg Technology Twitter page. And I'm on Twitter @JordanR1000, JORDAN, the letter R, number 1000. And please feel free to go to Bloomberg.com/technology. We've got a great podcast there called Decrypted. We've got a couple of these web shows as well. A colleague, Mark Gurman, has a great gadget show there as well. So with that, please tune in next week. We're on at noon Eastern, and thanks for watching.